You're all very welcome here to Clifton House this evening. Perhaps you've been here before, perhaps not. If you haven't, this magnificent building is one of the finest buildings in Belfast, if I may be permitted to say so. My name is Ronnie Weatherup. I'm the president of the Belfast Charitable Society, which is housed here in Clifton House. The building opened in 1774. So they've been holding meetings in this room for 250 years. Now, it's a pleasure tonight to welcome James and his talk, Dearly Departed, Body Snatching. And I see the word macabre mentioned there, so I'm sure you're all attracted to come here for that reason. Now, I just want to say a word about Clifton Street Cemetery, because when this building opened, there were three cemeteries that we know of in Belfast anyway. One was at Shankill, one was at Friars Bush, which is Strambolis, and the other was in the High Street beside what's now St. George's Church. And at that time, the sea came up to the High Street area, and unfortunately, it interfered with the burials in the churchyard there, and therefore it was closed down, and legislation was introduced to prevent any future burials in that area. Now, at that time, shortly after that, in fact, the Clifton House Cemetery opened in what was then part of the grounds of the Charitable Society. Were originally granted 19 acres, and they extended back to the Antrim Road from here. And as you well know, the burial ground is up next to Antrim Road on the other side of the what is now the Ring Road. So we're going to hear a little bit about that, and of course what came with it at that time, body snatching, because at that time there was no facility for the medical profession to obtain specimens for examination, and so they resorted to alternative methods in order to secure something. And James will tell us a little bit about that. First of all, though, housekeeping. These are my instructions here to offer to you. No planned fire alarms. So if it does go off, please follow the staff who will direct you out of the building. Bathrooms through the door on the right there. Mobile phones, switch off, please, so that we're on silent. I should welcome those who are online as well, because we're Zooming this evening. And for those of you online, you're very welcome. You will be muted, and I hope at your end you will remain muted and switch your camera off. And we can use a chat function, so that at the end, if there are any questions, if you bring them up on the chat facility, Lauren is going to monitor the questions, and we'll see if James can answer them. Now, our speaker is James, who's employed here as an archivist, archive and project coordinator. Now, I have here something called the Great Places. North Belfast Heritage Cluster is the brochure that you've got. There are 16 buildings which are within the care of this group, and they seek to rejuvenate this area by providing re-establishment of these buildings, some of which require particular attention, but they include the cathedral, of course, which is a fine building. They include this building and a number of others. They're all listed there, and their locations are listed, so I won't go through them, but you'll see the buildings, and that is an important project of which the Clifton House is an important part. And James, as archivist, in respect of it, is an important figure. Now, his background, and this is a note that Lauren has given me, is archaeology, geography, and history. Well, that's quite wide-ranging. So he has extended work on Victorian mental health asylums in Britain, not touch that this evening, and witch trials. That's another talk, another day. But for present purposes, his academic research focuses on memorials, ruins, and folklores as the influence that they might have on how history is perceived and understood. So a little memorials and ruins, a little about memorials and ruins may be heard tonight. Folk tales, I'm not so sure, but we'll see. So, welcome, James.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome. Thank you for braving the elements on such a lovely November evening. This research on this rather bizarre topic was conducted as part of my role as Archive and Project Coordinator of the North Belfast Heritage Cluster and their Great Place North Belfast project. The project is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and by the Belfast Charitable Society. Part of my role on this project is to conduct historical research and tell the stories of our cluster members and of North Belfast as a whole. The leaflets that we've left on the tables showcase all of the members of the cluster, and if you do enjoy this talk, the website will take you to many more pieces of research that I've done over the past couple of years. Now, some of our recent research focuses on an unsuccessful assassination attempt on one of the area's most prolific benefactors, Mr. Edward Benn, who's on the wall here, and the story of an old biscuit factory that sat on the corner of Donegal Street and Carrickhill that many of you will have passed on your way to get here tonight. These stories, of course, are not why you're here. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to revisit one of the weirder topics in recent history, body snatching, and look at how such a macabre practice came to thrive in the early decades of the 19th century. Now, I'll try and keep this talk quite light and upbeat, which, given the subject matter, is actually easier than you'll think. But I want to take you back to Belfast, a place where science was really struggling to gain a universal foothold, where it was seen as the domain of the rich and of the elite, to a small town where the poorhouse, where you sit today, was really on the outskirts of the city, a Belfast before City Hall and before the cathedral. A different era with different ways of life, different fashion, habits, and challenges. And one of these challenges was, of course, people stealing other people's deceased relatives. But I want to start this talk by asking you a rhetorical question. What do these two individuals have in common? The man on your right is Spencer Perceval, and the woman on the left is Mary Shelley. Now, Mary Shelley, obviously the author of Frankenstein, one of my all-time favorite books. And we'll come to Mary Shelley in good time. On the other hand, we have Spencer Perceval. And well, Spencer Perceval was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1809 and 1812. But he's also one of the best answers to impress friends and family this Christmas in a pub quiz. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, it's that Spencer Perceval is the only British Prime Minister to be assassinated while in office. So yeah, what do these two people have in common? And I believe the answer is this man, John Bellingham. Now, Bellingham was a sailor and a merchant, and he's also what those in the academic and historical community would call a complete disaster. As a sailor, he was a midshipman on a ship called the Hartwell, which was sailing from Kent to China. On that voyage, there was a mutiny, and the ship ran aground and sank off the coast of Africa. He then tried his luck on land by establishing a tin factory in London, which too went under. He was then declared bankrupt, and he later found himself working in Russia. While in Russia, he once again found himself shipwrecked, but this time he was blamed for the sinking and accused of sabotage. He was then imprisoned for 6 years. On returning to Britain, he was intent on claiming compensation he felt that he was owed by the government for his wrongful imprisonment. And he continued to push for this compensation for a further 3 years until 1812. After a visit to the Foreign Office, a civil servant reportedly told him he was at liberty to take whatever measures he thought proper. So he did what any rational person would do and promptly purchased 2 pistols at a gunsmith and got a tailor to sew concealed holsters into his coat. I think you can maybe see where this is going. As the story goes, on Monday, the 11th of May, 1812, Bellingham took a friend's family to an exhibition before remarking that he had some business to attend to. He then made his way to Parliament, where he waited in the lobby. When Prime Minister Perceval appeared, Bellingham stepped forward, shot him in the heart, and sat down on a nearby bench. When tried in the Old Bailey, Bellingham said he would have preferred to shoot the British ambassador to Russia, but insisted he was justified in killing the representative of those who wronged him. a rousing and resolute defence. He said, "Mr. Percival has unfortunately fallen the victim of my desperate resolution. No man, I am sure, laments the calamitous events more than I do. If I'd met Lord Gower, he would have received the ball and not Mr. Percival. What is my crime to the crime of government itself? It is no more than a mite to a mountain, unless it was proved that I had malice towards the unfortunate gentleman for whose death I am now upon my trial." He was found guilty and hanged 3 days later. But I wanted to tell you this story, start to finish, because it really sets the tone of the period, because it really does feel like a time a bit like a 70s sitcom, and how this period of history is often retold, almost as if it was taking place in folklore or a Terry Pratchett book. Even in the historical plaque that was erected in his place of birth, it simply states, "A failed businessman who blamed the government for his problems." So why am I telling you the story of John Bellingham? Because he was the exact sort of person who ended up on a dissection table in a medical school in Britain at the time. You see, the only bodies that were able to be dissected during the 19th century were the bodies of convicted criminals, whose dissection was ordered by the courts, most commonly murderers. This was due to the fact that dissection was seen as a fairly heinous practice and was condemned by religious leaders at the time, with some of them going as far as calling it a pagan practice. And this is because, according to religious teachings of the period, the body was seen as a religious symbol in of itself. The idea that we were made in God's own image led to many frowning upon any act to deliberately defile the body, such as dissection or autopsy, particularly as it was perceived that the only reason for dissections were to sate academic curiosity. Now, this conveniently made it suitable for the punishment that could be levied against the worst criminals. As it was sort of reviled by the church, ordering a body to be dissected after execution could be classed as punishment in this life and in the next. And these executions, and sometimes the dissections, were a great public spectacle, attracting thousands of locals. You can see the rightmost image depicts the execution of William Burke, a name many of you may be familiar with, and we'll come to him in due time. But he was being executed in a public forum with crowds looking on. And just to bring attention to the skull, that is John Bellingham's actual skull. It was kept in St. Bartholomew's Hospital after his execution and recently made the news because they took scans of it and used the technology to reconstruct what he would have looked like. Relying on bodies from executions caused a significant limit in the number of bodies available, particularly because during this time, the need and number of doctors was on the rise. And whilst the number of executions were comparatively in decline. So relying wholly on this one limited source meant there weren't enough bodies for students to dissect. Dissection of a human body was seen as a rite of passage for a medical student and was necessary for them to complete their training. Dissections were also the best way at the time of improving understanding of anatomy, disease, and the human body. And this too was heavily impacted by the single stream of bodies, as they were largely from a single demographic, namely males in their early 20s to late 40s, who until hours earlier were largely in good health. There wasn't much information to be gleaned from healthy bodies beyond the impact of the hangman's noose, as any chronic or long-term health conditions, such as heart disease or cancer, had not had the opportunity to reach the stage to which they would become fatal. So the single supply of bodies from the courts and gallows were now drastically outstripped by demand. And there was an increasing desire to diversify the types of bodies in the name of science. So some very industrious individuals went off in search of their own. Knowing that there was money to be made in doing the legwork and retrieving the freshly deceased, people began digging up the recently buried to sell to the good doctors. There are many ways in which they carried out their ghoulish task. Sometimes it involved bribing the gravekeepers, who could provide access and point out the fresh graves. Others relied more on secrecy than bribery, and they would visit the cemeteries during the day and sprinkle ground glass on top of the fresh graves. So when they would come back at night, the glass would glint in the lantern or moonlight, and then they could get to work. In order to retrieve the body, they would dig down at the head of the grave and smash open the coffin lid. They would send someone down, usually the smallest of the group, and often a child, because then the hole simply just didn't need to be as big. To loop a rope either around the neck or under the arms of the corpse, whereby the rest would haul the body out and cover the grave as if nothing had happened. After all, who would blink twice at a recently uncovered grave? A good body could go for up to £22 in 1830, which is about £2,200 today. But some extraordinary bodies, such as that of Charles Byrne, the Irish giant, who stood at 7'7" in 1783, sold for £500. And in 1783, that was about £65,000. And it was bought by a well-known Scottish doctor. Now, Byrne features at some point in this presentation, by the way, so see if you can spot him. And whilst I'm sure we will all agree that this act is reprehensible, morally despicable, and yet it was totally legal. There was a weird grey area in the law. Once you had died, your body was deemed worthless in the eyes of the law, regardless of its importance to the eyes of the church. It is here that there perhaps needs to be some clarification between body snatchers and grave robbers, descriptors I've seen used interchangeably, even though there are key differences. Grave robbers exhumed corpses with the express purpose of stealing things of inherent value: gold, shoes, clothes. This was theft and obviously carried a significant punishment. In comparison, because the body had no value, even though it could be sold for a significant price, it couldn't belong to the heirs, and therefore it was no real significant crime being committed. At most, you would be accused of trespassing or charged with a misdemeanor. And you had instances where grave robbers who were caught trespassing in the graveyards at night claimed to be body snatchers simply to escape a harsher charge. And whilst they may have escaped the book being thrown at them by the courts, the punishment would have been swiftly and thoroughly dealt out by their community. Both grave robbers and body snatchers were despised and reviled, as rightly they should. Now, the level of body snatching and area experience was inherently tied to the number of medical schools. In places such as Glasgow and Edinburgh, which had an abundance of medical schools, the cities became synonymous with the practice, as the bodies could be dug up and offloaded at their destinations with relative ease. In comparison, Belfast had only one medical school during this period, and it was located at Belfast Academical Institution, now known as RBAI. Anatomy had been taught in the school since 1818, with the medical school fully established in 1835. And as a former Estonian myself, I remember being told stories by the school prefects on my first day of bodies being discovered on the site of the sixth form centre at the school. Now, I know the presence of the medical college attached to the school accounts for these remains, but it's little comfort to my 12-year-old self, who of course conjured up stories of the fate of disruptive students who never made it home at the end of the day. Now, Belfast Inns has strong connections with the Charitable Society here at Clifton House. The former medical officer of the Poor House, Dr. James Drummond, was appointed as the Professor of Anatomy in 1818, and in 1835, following the establishment of the medical school, the Charitable Society gave Dr. Drummond a plot in the Poor Ground to bury the cadavers after dissection. But as Belfast only had one medical school, the demand for bodies in the immediate area was significantly lower. Such restrictions didn't deter a would-be body snatcher in Ireland, however. Instead, they decided to set up one of the world's grisliest export businesses and ship the dead bodies across the Channel to places like Scotland and England, or even down to Dublin. There is a great story about a body that ended up in Warrington, but we'll come to that shortly. But for the meantime, I want to focus on the evidence we have here in Belfast. In 2002, work was due to take place on the corner of Waring Street and Hill Street. That's maybe 2 streets beyond the cathedral on your way back into town. During the excavations at the site, archaeologists found the usual Victorian detritus: pipe stems, glass bottles, etc. But they also found this skull. What makes it interesting is that you can clearly see evidence of a procedure called trepanning. This involved drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure, and it's clear from the number of holes that this was used as a practice post-mortem. Further research in street directories show that several physicians and doctors lived on this street in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, whilst we have no way of knowing who the skull belonged to, or how it came to be in the possession of a practicing doctor, there's a real possibility that it could have been a part of a body that was stolen from one of the cemeteries nearby, as the doctors would have lived on the site during a period where body snatchers would have been operating in the 1800s. Going up the road now to Clifton Street Cemetery, or the new burying ground as it was known, evidence of body snatching as recorded in the records of the Belfast Charitable Society are surprisingly sparse. There's only one instance of body snatching that is recorded and named in the minute books here. The event occurred on the 12th of January 1824, and the quote on the screen now was sent to the Belfast newsletter on the 20th. A reward of £50 is offered by the committee of the Belfast Charitable Society to any person who shall within 6 weeks give information to the steward against and prosecute to conviction the person or persons guilty of the atrocious offence of entering the burying ground behind the poorhouse on Monday night and raising an infant's coffin several years interred. It remained unopened on the ground. Now, £50 was a lot of money in 1824, over £4,500, nearly double the amount the bodies were selling for. And through the work undertaken by some of the volunteers here at Clifton House, we also uncovered a failed body snatching attempt in February 1828 that was thwarted by the soldiers who were standing guard over the body of a recently deceased military surgeon, a Dr. Matthew Bailey. 5 men entered the cemetery at midnight and were spotted by the soldiers on guard. When the soldiers called out to them, the men fled and a running gunfight ensued down North Street. One of the men, a George Stevenson, was apprehended by a corporal who'd been on duty and who had heard the shots, and was sent to Carrickfergus to await trial on the charge of firing a pistol at 2 officers. Now, whilst this comparative sparseness of evidence cases may be a disappointment to some of you who came expecting juicy details of people wandering down Clifton Street to the docks with someone's deceased relative, ultimately, we've no way of knowing how many bodies were actually taken. These recorded instances were clearly either amateurish or interrupted, which resulted in the perpetrators being caught or evidence being left behind. Experienced body snatchers, on the other hand, would have left minimal trace. But there were also many deterrents to body snatchers that were employed, not only in Clifton Street Cemetery, but across Britain and Ireland. These are usually only afforded by the rich and wealthy. Mausoleums such as this one, built by the Dunville family, was not only an impressive monument, but it also kept the graves of the deceased safe. Other methods, such as this coffin guard, helped make exhuming the coffin much more difficult by making it either significantly heavier and harder to break into the coffin itself. And this coffin guard was actually found in the cemetery and is now with National Museums Northern Ireland. But a deterrent that is unique to Clifton Street Cemetery was actually the presence of the Charitable Society itself. As we saw on the previous slide, they were intent on pursuing any body snatchers that desecrated their cemetery. And this was because the cemetery was tied to the Charitable Society's reputation. The society operated it as a way to make money, whilst also using it to provide the poorest people in Belfast a place to bury their dead. Any activity or incidents that took place in the cemetery would negatively reflect on the society. By publicly pursuing body snatchers, the society protected an important business asset, which helped pay for the running of the building that you sit in today, but it also gave a level of protection to the poorest people buried in the cemetery, who otherwise would have presented the easiest target. Now, Belfast Charitable Society was not just reactive to instances of body snatching. They were also proactive, as in 1832, they employed watchmen to look after the cemetery at night. The first watchmen were selected through a vote and were Hans Stevenson and Charles Miller. In the minutes of their appointment, they also sought to recoup some of the salary by asking for a small contribution for each new burial. Their tenure would last until September 1832, when the Charitable Society took out an advertisement to notify the people of Belfast that they were discontinuing the watchmen. In this announcement, the Society were very candid about their rationale. The public were refusing to pay. In the Society's words, their trifling proportion. Now, the purpose behind the contribution towards the watchmen was twofold. Yes, they wanted to cover some of the cost, but it acted as an effective barometer, a measuring stick against which the need of the watchman was measured. If a large population of people didn't want to pay, then the concern around body snatchers in the area must have been on the decline amongst the general citizens of Belfast. Whilst the Charitable Society dismissed the watchmen, they were very clear they could not allow the more ad hoc system that came before to become the norm, where individuals hired their own personal watchmen or took it upon themselves. They stated it was both inefficacious of the purpose and productive of so much irregularity and immorality that it would be totally unjustifiable to allow it to be adopted again. This statement offers a glimpse into the reality faced by the Charitable Society regarding the burying ground at this time. Not only were they concerned about people stealing the dead, they also had to be concerned with the actions of the living. Now, this absence didn't last long, as less than 4 months later, the Society was looking to hire new watchmen. And this came about due to circumstances that occurred within the cemetery. There's no elaboration on what those circumstances were. However, based on what we've covered so far, it can be narrowed down to problems with the dead leaving the cemetery or the living entering it. The Society hired 4 watchmen: John McIlwain, James McFarlane, Peter Rowan, and Hugh Kilpatrick. Now, 2 of these watchmen would remain employed until March 1834. The other 2, McFarlane and McIlwain, had a much shorter tenure. On February the 27th, 1833, a meeting of the board of the Charitable Society was called to discuss an incident that occurred in the new burying ground on Monday, the 25th. 2 soldiers from the 80th Regiment of Foot, or the Staffordshire Volunteers, reported that shots had been fired at the Victoria Barracks from the neighbouring cemetery, with some shots shattering a window in the room where the soldiers were sleeping. In total, 6 shots were reported to have struck the barracks, with the first striking the centre pane of the window at 12:30 a.m. The 2 watchmen on duty, McIlwain and McFarlane, were dismissed of their duties. The remaining watchmen were begrudgingly given back their firearms, but provided only with blanks. Whilst body snatching and other unruly activities associated with the practice occurred across Britain and Ireland, this incident is by far the most unique to the new burying ground and is exclusive to the Belfast Charitable Society. And it's still told on tours today that the rifle downstairs is the exact one that was used to protect the cemetery, and that one morning soldiers marched to the poorhouse door and demanded to know why the Charitable Society had declared war on the British Army in the middle of the night. Now, we'll turn to more, if you pardon the pun, grave matters. There were some individuals who looked at body snatching and thought it sounded a bit too much like hard work. Getting up in the middle of the night in cold, bleak winters and digging through the frozen earth to reach their quarry. So they decided to acquire bodies in a different way, by killing people and selling them while they were still born. 2 of the people on the slide may be familiar to you. Burke and Hare, individuals who have gone down in history as 2 of Britain's most infamous serial killers. Over a 10-month span in 1828, they murdered 16 people and sold their bodies to Dr. Robert Knox. Each body netted the duo a total of £8. And it goes without saying that, unlike body snatching, murder was, and in fact still is, pretty illegal. Their crimes were eventually uncovered, and Burke would be sent to the gallows, where he would be hanged before being dissected himself. And the act of murdering someone with the intent to sell their body became known as burking. Now, the group below may be less familiar. They were the Bethnal Green Gang, otherwise known as the London Burker Gang. They were active a little bit later than Burke and Hare in 1831. And they were made up of 4 men: John Bishop, Thomas Williams, and James May. Not that one. A 4th man involved was Michael Shields, who's not pictured. The 4 men were responsible for exhuming and selling 500 to 1,000 bodies over a 12-year stretch, as per their sworn confession from 1831. However, Bishops and Williams took it a step further and murdered 4 people with the intention of selling their bodies to the medical facilities. Shields was not incriminated in the murders, whilst May was spared the gallows. but was transported to what is now Tasmania, where he died 3 years later and was buried in an unmarked grave on the Isle of the Dead, which seems somewhat ironic for a prolific body snatcher. There was immense public appetite to find out more about these burkers. After the arrests of Bishops, William and May, the police opened their house in which the murders took place to the public and charged 5 shillings a visit. Bishop and Williams were hanged in front of a crowd of thousands. And likewise for Burke's execution in 1829, nearly 25,000 people came to watch, with people offering access to their overlooking windows for a small fee, as can be seen here. After their executions, their bodies found their way into the same medical theatres as their victims, as they were dissected in the name of science. Burke's skeletal remains are still on display in the Anatomical Museum at the University of Edinburgh, whilst his life mask and a pocketbook that is bound in his tanned skin are held in the Surgeon Hall Museum. Not wanting to be outdone, there was, of course, burking in Ulster. Now, one of my favourites, I guess, if I can say that in reference to a murder case, is the case of Charles and Agnes Clark from Drumbo, down my neck of the woods. Now, I first found the story in a paper written by Professor Alan Evans, who I believe is still the current president of the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society. And in his article about body snatching, he said this about the Clarks. A case of burking in Ulster took place in Ballylesson, County Down, in January 1831. Charles and Agnes Clark of Drumbo were tried for the murder of an unknown person and of Daniel McConnell, whom they entrapped with the pretense of hospitality. Agnes Clark then tried to sell McConnell's body to a surgeon at Antrim Infirmary, who raised the alarm. Quite how she proposed to market a body with multiple hatchet wounds to the head is unclear, but she claimed that the death is the result of a stone quarry falling. As directed by the judge, their bodies were dissected, and in April 1836, casts of their skulls were donated to the Belfast Natural History Society. Now, body snatching and topics similar, as Sir Ronnie mentioned at the start, are of particular interest to me. They present a very tricky challenge to historians and researchers and academics. All historical research is akin to detective work. You're looking for that incident, that resource, or that piece of evidence to reinforce your argument or force you to change tact and acknowledge that your theory was wrong. Through the course of this research, there were a number of stories that demonstrated that body snatching took place in Belfast. And I've already told you a number of these instances through the course of the talk so far. Each instance I've referenced had at least one further piece of corroborating evidence to back up that story. The Belfast Charitable Society minute books provided a record for that failed instance regarding the child's coffin, whilst the story of Charles and Agnes Clark had the cast of their skulls, which at one point were in the possession of the Natural History Society. The story of the gunfight, which broke out at Clifton Street Cemetery, had me on the fence. There were a number of records about Dr. Bailey, including his obituary and the burial plot purchase records here at Clifton House. All good evidence. But the sticking point in my mind was the fate of George Stevenson, as he is noted as being arrested and sent to Carrickfergus for trial. But in the next court sessions, which were published in the newspaper, there's no trace of him. Now, my old archaeology professor used to reinforce that a lack of evidence does not constitute evidence by default. But the frequent absence of that key confirming piece of evidence, that moment where things seem to slot into place, feels ever elusive in this topic. And it's made me very cautious about the sources that I acknowledge as fact and sources that I simply acknowledge exist. And it's a key distinction that makes researching and writing about this topic so fun and interesting. Instead, I attribute the number of stories I'm able to corroborate as a revealing indicator as to the level of fascination with burking and body snatching, and the prevailing level of morbid curiosity that came to characterize much of the 1800s. Now, this can be seen from people flocking to see infamous criminals be hanged, the fascination and fixation on murders and serial killers such as Jack the Ripper in 1888, or the striped circus tents of P.T. Barnum's Victorian freak shows. And whilst a lot has changed since the 19th century, these stories of the macabre will still prove intriguing and interesting to us. After all, you braved the weather to be here tonight. Now, these stories surrounding body snatching have also offered insight into a phenomenon that we've become all too accustomed to in the digital era of 24-hour reporting cycles: fake news. The reason for my aforementioned caution with stories of body snatching is that a number of the stories I haven't been able to corroborate any of the evidence for. And I believe that the public appetite for news of body snatching, including all the juicy details, newspapers began to stretch the truth somewhat. Now, some newspapers, such as the Northern Whig, were prolific publishers of body snatching stories. And these stories were not replicated across any other papers. Many of the stories may, in the long run, prove to be genuine, but I was able to find one that I've been able to disprove in its entirety. And that proves that some papers seem to adhere to the old adage, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Now, this particular story was actually the catalyst for me starting this journey down this rather odd rabbit hole. On a tour of the cemetery, our guide retold the story of a John Fairclough from 1828. He was buried on a Thursday in Clifton Street Cemetery, before then turning up in Warrington, in England, on the Sunday, having been transported there in a barrel marked spiced pork. Now, the story has been quoted by a number of different people in the area, with the main difference being the barrel being labelled as a different type of meat. But the name, date, and destination have all remained the same. So with all this information, as I said, name, date of death, the link to the cemetery, and the charitable society, I was certain that I would be able to find out more about this man and his posthumous journey. Nope, not a single shred of evidence that this man ever existed. No death certificate, no obituary, no newspaper coverage in any other newspaper. No plot or burial listing either. And not a mention about a John Fairclough or any body snatching incident in the board minutes either. Until I came across a legal case that was reported in the Liverpool Albion, parking from 1828, Rex v. Davis, in which the body of a Jane Fairclough was discovered at the house of a Dr. Moss, a physician in Warrington. Jane had died aged 24 and was buried in Hillcliffe Burial Ground on the Friday, before the grave was discovered as disturbed on the following Monday. And then later, the body was discovered at Dr. Moss's house on the Tuesday. Davis, who was an apprentice at the dispensary, was fined for his role in the body snatching, and the story had been adopted with some facts changed to be passed off as a local story. On a brief side note, the story was very reminiscent of to me of the nursery rhyme about Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, christened on a Tuesday, etc. Except buried on a Thursday, snatched on a Friday, chipped on a Saturday, and discovered on the Sunday. And while the comparison is meant to be in jest, I found that the nursery rhyme was first recorded in the 1840s, which again highlights how morbid this period in history was. Now, the story of John Fairclough highlights the issue that academics have in verifying instances of body snatching. The secretive nature of body snatching, coupled with a public appetite for hearing about it, left it an ideal stomping ground for journalists willing to stretch the truth. And these stories resulted in a public familiar with every reported detail, accurate or not, taking it upon themselves to protect their loved ones' remains. Now, as previously highlighted, these vigilantes proved a nuisance to the charitable society, and we can see how there's a potential link between major events in the news and a need to take control of situations in the new burying ground. The London Burqa Gang were tried and executed in December 1831, with the first watchman being hired in the burying ground one month later in January 1832. And we already know from the minutes that immorality was occurring in the cemetery as a result of these unpaid watchmen. And an extract from the Northern Whig further highlights that it may have been the need to regulate the unruly living as much as the wandering dead. As it states, in consequence of those persons lately interred in the Poorhouse burying ground, having been in the habit of firing guns charged with slugs and bullets, which sometimes alarmed the neighbours and passengers, and also injured the tombs and headstones, the Poorhouse Committee lately came to a resolution that they would employ 2 reasonable persons. They will be well armed and will have watchdogs constantly with them. Now, in the lifespan of body snatching, 1832 was late in the day to be implementing prevention tactics, as it was the same year the Anatomy Act was passed. And this act was meant to put an end to body snatching once and for all. The Anatomy Act opened up alternative pathways for doctors to acquire bodies for dissection, whilst also finally criminalising the act of body snatching itself. What had previously been a single method was expanded with the hope that an increased supply would render body snatching, and more importantly, burking, obsolete. It did have a number of flaws and proved unpopular amongst public and politicians alike. The legitimate methods were expanded from just the bodies of condemned criminals to include unclaimed bodies from morgues and workhouses, as well as offering the ability for people to donate their bodies to science. Now, whilst improving the supply seems fine in principle, it was their execution that resulted in the act being deeply unpopular, as people saw it as the government equating the poor and needy who looked to the workhouses as their last resort as equal in the eyes of the governing to the worst of criminals. Anti-anatomy protests took place in objection to the bill, with some questioning why doctors and scientists were being indulged to such a degree, and the expense of the country's poorest and most vulnerable. Now, it's important to note that the Anatomy Act didn't stop body snatching overnight. The practice continued for decades, as supply and demand continued to fluctuate. From the criminal records available online, there are examples of charges levied against individuals for continuing to practice in the now illegal trade. There was a John Craig Hodgson from York who was imprisoned for a year for conspiring to steal dead bodies in August 1832. Another example was John White Bridgman, who was charged in October 1843 and again sentenced to 1 year in prison. Less of an all-encompassing bill and more of a damp squid. But that is with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, people continued protesting and rallying against the bill. People such as this man, William Cobbett, who was a member of the Radicals Party, a precursor to the Lib Dems, and a staunch critic of the act. He stated, "They tell us it was necessary for science. Science? Why? Who is science for? Not for poor people. Then if it is necessary for science, let them have the bodies of the rich, for whose benefit science is cultivated." During this period, doctors and scientists were not in the good graces of the public. They had been in cahoots with the morally depraved body snatchers and burkers, all in the pursuit of knowledge that was frowned upon by the church and questioned long-standing traditions of, if I was being flippant, leeches and questionable concoctions. In fairness to Cobbett, it didn't help that some doctors presented themselves in quite a cartoon villain type of way. Take, for example, Dr. John Hunter, Scottish surgeon and an important figure in medical history. In his portrait, just behind Dr. Hunter, you can just make out some skeletal feet. Those are the remains of Charles Byrne, the body of whom, if you recall from the beginning of the lecture, John Hunter had bribed and bartered for back in 1783. Now, Byrne's body never actually made it to his desired burial place. Conscious that John Hunter and his deep pockets were circling him as his health deteriorated, Byrne made arrangements to be buried at sea in a lead-lined coffin. The specifics of how Hunter acquired the body of Charles Byrne has been disputed. Some point the finger at the undertaker for filling the coffin with rocks. Others lay the blame at the feet of Charles Byrne's circle of friends. The skeleton is pictured here, displayed in Hunter's official portrait, and his body would remain on display until 2020 in the Hunterian Museum. Initially, it was an oddity attraction, a morbid curiosity that sated the appetite of the curious Victorians. But more recently, DNA was extracted from one of his teeth and was used to identify the gene that caused his abnormal height. His body has now been removed from public display, and discussion now centres on whether he should be finally laid to rest 250 years after his death. So yeah, you can see that those in the medical profession were not exactly beloved in their community. People assumed they were hell-bent on the pursuit of knowledge, committing crimes against God, common decency, and the law to further their curiosity, which rather handily brings me back to the rhetorical question I posed at the very start of this lecture. What do Mary Shelley and Spencer Perceval have in common? Of course, I established at the beginning, I think it was John Bellingham. You see, after Bellingham's execution, his body was given to be dissected in the Royal College of Surgeons. And during this time, there was significant fascination with the use of electricity and reanimation of the dead. Great success was achieved during Bellingham's dissection, as they explored how long a heart could be made to move after death. And in this instance, Bellingham's heart continued to beat for nearly 4 hours. While we can't be sure if it was this exact dissection in 1812 or one of the others during this period that may have inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818, I can't think of a better analogy on which to end that best encapsulates the prevailing feeling of the time. The Mad Doctor and the Misunderstood Creation, a Gothic tale that, much like the stories of body snatchers, still endures the test of time, but could only be a product of this murky, muddy, and often weird part of the 19th century.
Well, thank you, James. That was intriguing. I'm going to ask you for questions. First of all, I have a question, I think, and that is about the medical profession in all of this. Now, you touched on it there about the medical profession. I assume that the official medical position was not to encourage this, but the doctors, of course, play a key part in it. So, and I noticed that what was the name of the Fairclough? The doctor was convicted in Fairclough, but I wonder to what extent there were proceedings against doctors for this, and to what extent the medical profession as a controlling body, whatever the medical profession controlling body was at that time, took action against the doctors who were contributing to this.
Well, certainly the life in that period was inherently unfair, and a lot of the doctors came from like upper class of society. So a lot of the trouble that they got in would have been quickly sort of dispelled due to connections or influence. The Rex v. Davis case was important because it was the first time that a doctor had been incriminated in any way. Normally, the fault was laid firmly at the feet of the body snatchers, with the doctors sort of being able to take a step back fully from it. So that really marked the change and necessitated the act coming into play 4 years later, because all of a sudden the doctors were now in the firing line. So they had to sort of get in the ears of their mates in the upper class and in the in Parliament, in politics, to really get the law changed to keep them protected. But equally, I think it's really important to recognize that regardless of how awful the act of body snatching and burking was, a lot of the information that we know to have gotten from that period would have come from illegally gotten bodies. So it's a really complex subject to try and figure out where we would be without the advancement that was made during this period, because advancement on treatment for illnesses such as heart disease and cancer and those lifelong illnesses came on leaps and bounds because of the bodies that were acquired illegally. So I know that in the journals of some of the doctors, they justified their actions, but because science was still quite seen as the haunts of the rich and not affecting the poor in any way, the class divide was really a key sort of wedge that drove between them.
Thank you, James. Now, are there any questions in the room? Yes, this gentleman.
So you mentioned that if they find the skull, the drilling in the skull itself. I'm just wondering, was there any evidence, like through time, was there like trends or like common practices of dissections that doctors followed, or was it all just quite random? They got a body and they all did an approach.
From what I've read, there was sort of, because they, and this sounds really bad, because they didn't really know what they were doing. There was tend to be sort of like, not flavors, but those ideas that seem to be geographically centered. So you might have had like French doctors in particular focusing on one certain thing at a time. And over the course, I think it was about 1812 to 1816, the British doctors were really keen to investigate the impact of like electrical impulses, which later on, I think they found out was just they happened to be channeling down the sort of like, okay, well, we can discover loads about the nerves and the nervous system, whereas in a different part of the world they may have been thinking entirely differently. But I think they're sort of poking around in the dark a little bit to try and just uncover anything. You would have had certain doctors really focusing on sort of, you know, skeletal remains or you know, like long-term illnesses. It was very much sort of like an open field for them. They really had no sort of markers that they could draw on. But I think it was geographically focused because they would have been talking to each other and sort of, I have an idea here, let's try this, which seems really morbid when you think about them sort of discussing what they were going to be doing at the next persod they had on their dissection slab. But it did seem to be very geographical and then targeted within their colleagues as they sort of explored and looked for sort of avenues to explore that.
Thank you. Oh, well, here, this lady.
I was wondering if there was any connection with the body snatching stories, in particular with Carrick Fergus. I had family attend a few years back a tour here, and they came back with a story about how there was something Belfast Harbour was too busy and populated, so people would use Carrick Fergus for them to transport bodies. Is there any truth in that?
It's certainly very feasible. I mean, a lot of them may not even use harbours at all. I know that some of them would have literally just tried to figure out any way to get it from one place to the other. In terms of specific examples, I haven't gone that far into researching around Carrick Fergus, but certainly from the work that I have done, it was literally a battle to try and get it out of here to wherever it was going. They would have taken every advantage and every avenue, even if that was like a sizable rowboat and a couple of people just to try and get it to the coast. From what I understand, so long as there was a chartered route from Carrick Fergus to likes of Edinburgh, Glasgow, or like Liverpool, any of the larger cities with medical institutions, they would have tried it. They would have, you know, and simply because it wasn't illegal, and because it was probably also a massive hassle, it would have slowed everything down. If you think of, yes, you might have a body, a barrel marked whatever, bacon, spiced pork. You also probably have several other barrels of actual food that then would have to be waylaid and delayed and may arrive spoiled at its whatever intended destination. So finding a body would have really put the spanner in the works. So they may, a lot of the time, may have stumbled across a body rather than actually canvassing for it. So I would be very surprised if they didn't try. I can't think of any specific examples on the top of my head.
Yes.
Several questions. It's like once you good stories, as soon as you tell you one thing, I'll have about 600 questions. But I'll try and leave this. They're all related. You said there was only one teaching hospital in Belfast, and you said most of the people were looking for Glasgow, Edinburgh, and London. Was there anything in Dublin, and if so, would it not have been simpler for the body snatchers to have less hassle by taking them to Dublin than all that ordeal trying to get through the ports and barrels and travel over Scotland? Why was there not a bigger train or do we just not know?
It's simply just time. Transporting it across the channel would have taken less time than transporting it from Belfast to Dublin in those days. You have to imagine that it probably at most you had 4 or 5 days to transport a body after getting it out of the ground. Now you get a head start on transporting it down to Dublin if you were sort of like left immediately after getting it out of the ground, but you would be caught up quite quickly whenever you get around to sort of getting it on the ship and across. And especially if you think you're probably landing in Glasgow right in the heart of the city, rather than having to traverse through the outskirts. Not to mention, depending on what time of the year as well, it would also likely be inherently colder while you're doing that sea crossing, which would add a couple of hours as well. And that's all vital because by the time sort of decay sets in, you're thinking like you're seeing the cost of the body go down depending on the condition, and after a while you'd just be left with a corpse that then you have to dispose of because it wouldn't be worth anything to the doctors. So we certainly did send bodies down to Dublin, but they were probably also less often caught. But you think of the other sort of like more rural cemeteries that would have been en route from Belfast to Dublin, those cemeteries would have been primed for the picking because you wouldn't have to leave a busy city to get it into another big city, and it would be closer. Whereas we have the harbour right, like the port right here, and you can get them away and out if you have a boat schedule or if it's part of a manifesto of a different vessel very quickly. So that's just, definitely they did have medical facilities in Dublin. It's just depending on the individual and personal preference. The balance of time, ease, connections, that sort of thing.
Also, I think it took all day to get to Dublin from here at that time.